As part of a personal project I'm working on, I spoke with Jeff, one of the authors of this book, Introduction to Ecological Psychology. I spoke about it before on the channel, and this video actually cuts up some of the topics that we discussed through our hour-long conversation into a more digestible video. If you're new or intrigued by this idea of ecological psychology, I suggest having a listen and see if you resonate with any of the ideas or topics that we talk about. When it comes to ecological psychology, when did you get into it? Was it at your undergrad?
Had a combination of professors at undergrad. So I went to a small college in Pennsylvania called Franklin and Marshall College. And one of my professors there was Ed Reed. And I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. It was over my head. But I also had at the same time another professor named Fred Owens, and he was a more straightforward perception psychologist. And the combination of those two together led me to ecological psychology. When I applied to graduate school, I applied all over the board. And then I chose to go to the University of Connecticut, which is the epicenter for the ecological approach in the last 40 years. So
with the ecological approach, you said it went over your head. I feel like everyone feels the same when you see some of the words and the terms and the ideas. They're so radical, for lack of a better term. What was it that actually grabbed your attention? Because my exposure was through sports coaching.
What grabbed me is that always interested in this concept of affordances. I never had a name for it, but I kind of knew there was this ability to perceive opportunities to do stuff. And I was always interested in intention, but without really understanding what that was. I knew that there was a point where I performed a behavior, and there was a point before that where I was preparing, and there was something I was interested in, that how that the one turned into the other. And I guess the other thing that really turned me on to it was the interest in perception by touch, perceiving what you can do with an object, tool use. One of the sports that I played as a kid, and actually one of the sports I still play as an adult, is ice hockey. And so holding a stick, using a stick to perform an action by moving another object to achieve a goal. And it's like that, it just sort of everything all fell into place because of my lived experience. At some point it made sense to me. But you're right, the terminology at first it just was foreign.
So how did you go from like the undergrad going, what in the world is this, to writing some of the more complex papers that I've read, at least?
What did that for me was having Michael Turvey in the classroom, partly with him, but also sitting with the ideas. So having him in the classroom and being able to have a back and forth, that helped a lot. And the other thing that I did was in reading those papers as part of that class, this is back in the late 1990s, I had an actual dictionary next to me. So I would read the paper, I would say, I don't know what that word is. And I'd go, oh, and I would, it took a lot of, I don't know, detective work.
There is a lot of ideas in ecological psychology. Which ones do you, or which, obviously it's going to be biased towards what you're focused on now, but which ones do you, I guess, resonate with the most?
Well, I think this idea of affordance is one that it has always made sense to me. And now it's become a worldview for me. It's become, I now see everything in terms of that. And I think it's a concept that can be applied to coaching, can be applied to technology, can be applied to really everything. Everything's an opportunity in some sense or another. And so that's been a really powerful concept for me. I think and then together with that is this idea of prospectivity, the idea that perceiving is about the future and about how that is not, it sounds like an impossibility. It sounds like something spooky or magical, but it's really just the way it is. And I think that's also something I think that's really powerful, that you don't need to predict the future because you can perceive it. Taking this concept, this idea, this concept of perceiving, and opening it up so that it doesn't just apply to this slice of time, that changes the game, I think. That's I think part of what makes it challenging, is because it's not a momentary process that is then handed off to the next step in the process. It's a completely different model for thinking about how perceiving works.
How did you make that shift? You mentioned it being a worldview shift. How did you shift the way that you explained and thought about perceiving?
Well, as far as perceiving the future, I realized that it can't be any other way. I guess I just realized that behavior is continually adjusted. You don't wait until you crash into the object and then change your path. You do it 2 or 3 steps ahead. Everything is ahead of time, goal directed. I guess one of the things that's been informative to me is just watching other animals, watching cats, dogs, and squirrels and horses, and just realizing that that's what they're doing too. A horse jumps over the fence. It has to initiate the jump before it gets to the fence. It just, there's no other way.
And I guess when it comes to your experiences and your explanations about whatever it is that you're doing, is there a similar sort of story, narrative, or it wasn't just a switch, I imagine?
So we have a dog now, and several dogs ago we had a dog that would eat anything and everything, and so we trying to figure out how to keep this dog from doing those things. And we had one of our colleagues come over who is an animal behavior person who runs a canine clinic, and she didn't use these words exactly, but she basically said, well, you need to change the affordances. You need to make it so that the dog does not have the opportunity to do the stuff you don't want it to do. Like, well, of course we do. Like, if you put the food in a place where the dog can't reach it, problem solved. I was just like, wow, yes, that's the easiest way to ensure that, the dog won't do what you don't want it to do.
Yeah, it sounds really like obvious, like duh, but sometimes it takes the sort of someone explaining that or showing that to you for you to realize, oh yeah, actually there is a simple solution here.
In performing a movement, the job of the performer from an ecological dynamic systems perspective is to provide the right forces at the right time, not all of the forces all of the time. And as an educator or a coach, it's the same thing. You just want to just provide the right constraint, the right scaffolding, you want to guide the forces so that the outcome is guaranteed. We were talking about trampolining and gymnastics earlier, and this is something that I remember from when I was learning those skills. I remember learning to do a backflip and realizing that when I experienced, again, I didn't have the words or the concepts to explain this, but I knew whether or not I was going to land it based on optic flow patterns. I didn't know what optic flow was, but you take off and you're like, oh boy, this isn't going to work. Or, okay, this is a good one. And it wasn't because of the angle of my, hips. It just was like, okay, I can tell by the way the world is moving that I'm going to be okay, or I better, put my hands out. Or related to that, trampolining is another great example of not providing all the forces all the time, right? You have to use the equipment. If you don't use the trampoline right, you won't get the rebound. You'll be fighting it. Or, there's a way to stop yourself from bouncing if you need to stop. And so then you counter the forces of the trampoline, but using the equipment in a way where you're just complementing what's already present. Having a background in gymnastics made me understand that concept and get it. But it applies not just in that context, but in all movement, even movement that isn't athletic at all, just standing, reaching, or stepping. There's always forces provided for free, and your job is just to harness them, just to exploit them, and supplement them to get to turn those forces into the outcome you want.
Now, I think that term, there's a lot of things that could mean, neurodivergence. But you mentioned ecological psychology as a sort of a alternative worldview, as it were, and I feel like a lot of ecological psychologists have very similar views on most topics. And I think a field of the field of affordances could explain some of the neurodivergences that people are talking about now.
A more traditional way to look at those differences is to look inside the person, and that's and the ecological approach. The other concept that I think you asked before about the concepts that really resonated with me, the other one is the animal environment system. Realizing that an affordance is an opportunity based on this fit, and that fit is what changes in neurodivergence, or physical disability, or that's what changes the field of affordances. That if you are in a wheelchair, some opportunities become available to you and others disappear, and the same thing happens to people who you have neurodivergence, ADHD or ASD or something else. You may feel, okay, well, these opportunities are no longer present, or are these are more available to me. You can think of the field of affordances, it's really just a map, and it's a map of it's a layout of territory, and it's explicit recognition that affordances don't appear one at a time. Right? Affordances, there are dozens of affordances all the time, and sometimes acting on one changes that landscape. It's a dynamic landscape. So acting on one affordance will make other ones available and disallow others. And so it's just a recognition of the embeddedness, the necessary embeddedness. But when we talk about perceive this affordance, perceive that affordance, it feels very sequential, and it is sequential, but not just sequential.
The way I visualize this is you've probably seen like the music bars as sound waves go up and down. That's how I visualize the field of affordances as time moves through. They go up and down through various scales. That to me explains it's easier for me to explain my experiences through this dynamic field of affordances through various scales than, as you mentioned, this chain-like sequence of you do this and this and this, because there are so many other scales that may not be obviously causing something, but they do potentially.
This is one of the reasons that I think ecological psychology is so challenging, is because it takes a field-based perspective, when most of science, or at least the science that we're used to, is a particle-based perspective. And that's the same way. The particle-based perspective is what puts what makes it so that we look inside the person to find the interesting parts rather than the system, the relationship. The field-based perspective says it's the relationship that matters, not the thing that matters, and that's really hard to wrap your head around. You may or may not be aware of this, but it might be it's in the 1930s. Gibson wrote what was sort of the first inkling of this affordance concept, in something called the field of safe driving.
I didn't know.
It's a brilliant paper. It's a first attempt to talk about affordances, and he talks about driving at an intersection, and that given us the arrangement of cars and traffic lights, there's a field through which that car could travel. But if a car comes from the intersection, then that field shrinks, because now you are less able to you can't get closer to that car. That car is moving, so it's changing sort of the dynamic lane through which you could drive. And if it's night and your headlights, only shine so bright, it shrinks it this way. So it was this sort of dynamic stretching of the field of safe driving, and it changes as you're moving. It changes as other objects come and go. Yeah, so this idea of a field, that there's this extendedness, there's this relation, there's these relations that are the key. The field only emerges because of those relations. That makes the ecological approach a bit foreign.
I feel and I'm biased, but I feel the ecological approach has allowed me to explain my experiences clearer, at least for myself. And I feel other people understand my experiences also clearer because there's less confusion when I'm explaining my experiences now. And when it comes to the advice giving that I've seen online through science communication, through whoever, most of it is very internal. You need to focus on this thing, or you need to follow these rules because that's where your brain works. And this internal insert biological mechanism is doing this to you. And for me, it's so frustrating to hear those things because my question now is, well, what context are they in? What's happening in the environment? What relationship do they have with everything else that's going on, both present, future, and past?
The context is really critical, because of that fit, because of the relationship, right? Because the animal stays the same, and in different contexts, that fit changes, and so it's challenging from any other perspective to understand, why does the behavior change in a different context when the animal is always the same? I mentioned I played hockey as a kid. I still do now. One of my hockey teammates who's an ophthalmologist, and he was really confused because he was telling me that, some of his patients, when he does the eye testing in his office, their vision's perfect, but they complain that they can't see as well as they would like to. He asked me, well, is there any explanation for this? And I was like, well, you're testing them by showing them letters in a dark room on a screen, and they're sitting still at these, and maybe what the vision that they want, maybe they're talking about their vision for sports, or their vision for driving, or their vision for doing something that's not quite what you're testing them for. The context is different, the fit is different. I guess he was taking a perspective where you got the same animal, they got the same physiology, they should be the same performance. Well, not necessarily.
And I feel ecological psychology is the it depends explanation because it always depends. There's always variability. It's inevitable. But ecological psychology can help explain the it depends scenario.
And you made me think of the concept of invariants, because invariants are what's changing despite all of those changes. Like, how to catch a ball. Well, you could calculate the path of the ball, but it depends on whether it's windy that day, or how big the ball is, or how, all these. But from the ecological perspective, it's actually the rate of optical expansion will give you information about when the ball will arrive, regardless of those things. And I think okay, so I think this is what you're getting at, that because ecological psychology is a law-based approach, it's general. It's necessarily general. It applies across circumstances. That's the whole point of a law-based approach. You don't need different explanations for different situations. And that also applies for different animals. You don't need a different explanation for an animal that has a very different brain, or no brain, or no nerve, or an animal or an organism that without a nervous system, like a plant. It all should have the same underlying principles, maybe at different scales, but the same principle should apply across the board.
Julia mentioned a paradigm shift inside of the way science is studied. Is there anything similar? Like, would you agree that there's going to be one, or there is one?
I think that has happened to an extent with this dynamical systems, complex systems perspective. I think that that has spread, that's a tool set that the ecological approach relies on, and that has gotten into a whole lot of places. What needs to come along with it, and maybe it will, is this idea of this the lawfulness of perceiving. Another thing that has really spread quite a bit is the relationship between perceiving and acting. That's pretty much taken as a given, I think. That's the ecological approach. Affordances are where the theory goes necessarily, but where the theory starts is the directness of perception. Yeah, it really is something you have to take as a whole. You can't really pick and choose with it. And I appreciate that researchers are borrowing terms, or in some cases trying to bend two perspectives together. They say, okay, well, I like this idea of affordance, but I'm going to stick with this idea that perceiving and moving is, computational or representational. I'm going to try and bring these together. And the way I always talk about this is, it's not always the case that when you bring two things together, you end up with something better. The example I give sometimes is, well, I like beer and I like mustard, but when you put them together, you get something that's worse than either one. That doesn't, it doesn't work that way. Like you can't just blend and try and get something that's better.
Yes, there are new terms to become familiar with in ecological psychology, but once you've grasped the majority of the terms, constraints, affordances, invariants, attractors, there's not many more. Whereas when I read a book about cognitive psychology, you may have 7 or 8 different theories that are using various terms that try to explain the same sorts of things. So you've got short-term memory, working memory, short-term working memory, long-term memory, and various models within all of those, which add so many different concepts and terms to try and understand what it is people are talking about. Cognitive load, another example. Is it perceptual load, attentional load, focus load, cognitive load, the various versions of it? The ecological approach doesn't seem to have all of these things, from my experience at least.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think because it's about trying to find trying to find the invariants, trying to find the concepts that apply across circumstances. The more bits and pieces you need to build in, the greater the likelihood that they won't apply to another situation, another species, another circumstance. You mentioned talking to Damien Kelty-Stevens that these changes occur non-linearly. There's a cascade, and those cascades can take these small changes at small differences and blow them up into big differences. There's a continuity that I think gets lost in some of the more computational approaches, where there's these not only distinctions between perceiving and memory, but distinctions between this kind of animal and this kind of animal. And it just makes you have to reinvent the wheel every time you go through the process.
But I guess why would people be interested in ecological psychology if they're not already? Like, how would you introduce it? Why would they be interested to get involved? Like, what's the point?
Yeah, so the way I explain this to people is that I'm interested in how we perform everyday behavior, and sometimes not so everyday behavior, like skilled performance. But I think I try to pitch it as, this is a way to understand what's sometimes described as everyday coping. Everyday coping and I don't mean coping with, I mean coping with challenges and problems, like I want to step over that curb and not trip. I want to, reach my coffee cup. And so you're faced with these everyday problems, and you have everyday successes. That's another way I describe it, is that I think the more traditional approaches are interested in the infrequent and sometimes spectacular failures And the ecological approach is more interested in the mundane, the everyday successes, how the process goes right in the background rather than goes wrong in illusions or errors.
Now, ecological psychology is a huge field with various topics, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is a video essay where I discussed most of what's talked about inside of this book.